Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. Now on this show, I'm speaking with Ben Cattaneo. Ben is qualified as a guest for two main reasons. The first is that he's been a risk professional all his life. He's worked in a large number of countries and different sectors, so has some really deep expertise in the field of risk. He's also the host of the All Things Risk podcast, which is a podcast looking at, you guessed it, anything relating to risk. And he's interviewed over 100 people for that show, including myself, so has plenty of insight from people in different spheres of life, talking about risk and different manifestations of it. He's also highly entertaining, so I'm sure you're going to enjoy the conversation that we had. Now, two things I need to caveat. Firstly, we recorded this well before the real impact of the coronavirus was known on a global basis, so we don't focus particularly on it, but I'm pleased to report that many of the things we talked about resonate and are relevant for the world as we understand it today. The second thing is, because our conversation was fairly lengthy, I've split it up into several parts. So in this, the first part, you'll hear about Ben's career, you'll hear about some of the challenges of risk perception, and we start to explore some of the ideas about how organizations can better go about managing and mitigating risk. It's a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Here's me talking to Ben Cattaneo. Ben Cattaneo, host of the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. This is going to be a lot of fun. It's a pleasure to be here, and I loved having you on my show. So wonderful to return the favor, and I think we're going to have another fabulous conversation.
Well, it's great to have you here, and I do want to pick your insights later on around your podcast and how it came about and the sorts of things you've learned from it. But perhaps to kick off, to give my listeners a kind of idea of who you are, can you just talk us a little bit about your career? Because you have literally spent your lifetime working in risk.
Yeah, I did. And I have. My risk career is nonlinear. So I started my risk career actually in political and security risk. And that was because my academic background was in international relations, international economics, and international politics. And when I finished my studies, I looked at the career options and I thought, don't really fancy myself working for an NGO or the United Nations. In fact, I worked for the United Nations for about a year, and it was incredibly bureaucratic. And I just thought, there's no way I can do this for the rest of my life. And I also looked at the option of being a diplomat. Now, at that time, that was sort of the end of the Cold War. It was before the 9/11 situation. And basically the career options, everyone was telling us in international relations, if you want to work for the Canadian Foreign Service, you need an MBA. This is all about finance. It's the end of history. It's all about this sort of thing. So Having a background in international relations and geopolitics, we don't need that anymore. The Cold War's over. So that's fine. Look elsewhere. There were few options to join the government, and I don't think I would have been that great of a civil servant anyway. So I started to explore, well, what could I do with my background? And I came across this thing called political risk. And when I was a grad student, the way I tried to get into this industry is by doing a master's thesis on political risk in South Korea, where I taught English before I did my master's degree. And so this was after the Asian financial crisis. And I loved it. I loved doing field research. I got a grant. I did field research. And I thought, I wonder if I could do something like this for companies, because if we have globalization, companies are investing globally, trading globally. So there must be ways in which I could apply my skills to a different context. And that's been a theme throughout my career, is applying my skills to a different context. And I found a small company by the name of Control Risks. I was studying in Switzerland, in Geneva at the time. And I thought I'll send off my CV to the HR department. And so I did it. And I heard Jack Squad. And about a year later, I found myself in the Philippines, and lo and behold, I saw that they had an office in the Philippines. And I went and I just kind of knocked on the door of the country manager, and we had a chat.
You literally just doorstepped them.
Yeah.
And just went, hello.
Yeah. It was a lesson in, just go around the HR department because they're not the people that are hiring anyway. And I learned that lesson fairly early on. I applied, I don't know how many jobs after, I thought I've got this master's degree. I've got a little bit of international experience. I should be a hot commodity. I was not. It was really hard to get to apply my skills. I've always had to kind of fight to get into organizations that I wanted to work for and be a part of. And so what happened was I got a short-term contract, and that turned into a longer contract, and then that turned into a full-time role. And the kind of stuff I was doing was fascinating because I was working with foreign investors that were operating in the Philippines. And for someone with my background in international relations and politics, economics, risk, it was all about risk, and I loved it. My first project was for a Japanese construction company that had an extortion that went awry. The extortion was carried out by communist insurgents, and they had a security incident, and I got into all the root causes about why that happened. And it was because they weren't dealing with the community relations properly, and the social impact of their project wasn't fully considered, and all of this really interesting stuff. And I did a number of projects like that. And it was such a wonderful training ground of pulling from different types of fields and areas of expertise and applying them through the lenses of risk. So risk was the kind of common thread. So how do you get a Japanese construction company to think about social impact and community relations? Well, by risk, by thinking about the security risks of a major investment and the impacts of having that investment shut down. It was the same thing. I saw the same thing over and over again with oil companies, with mining companies. How do you get them to think about in the early days where corporate social responsibility was not a thing, was not a big thing? How do you get them to think about risk or think about social and environmental impacts? It's about risk. Risk is the lens. And that was just a wonderful kind of training ground in the Philippines for this company, Control Risks. And after a few years, there was a job that opened up in London. It's a British company. So I applied and got that role in London, and I became a political risk consultant. And I was doing roughly the same type of thing, same type of work. But now I was looking at Africa and Latin America and things like this. And so that's how I got my start in risk, is by applying my skills in international relations and international politics to the business and investment world. And then because of my interest in that type of risk, I started to get more and more involved in sustainability and corporate responsibility. And I worked for a sustainability company. And as I kept moving kind of up the corporate rung in terms of quality of consulting and clients, I thought, well, there's this thing called risk management, enterprise risk management. Wouldn't that be cool? And I got more and more involved in those types of in that type of work, and I find myself now working, full time in risk management. So I moved on from a couple of other companies through to Accenture, where I did risk work, and now I work as a risk manager in a telecoms company. And it's great fun. I love risk. I love thinking about risk because I love that ability to take thinking and there's that book Range that came out, David Epstein, who talks about taking different disciplines and combining them and creating insights. And I love doing that. To me, that's what risk is all about. It's a proactive activity. And conversely, at the same time, as I move my way up to closer to the C-suite, the more I find that organizations don't take risk very seriously. It's this legal compliance thing that people have to do. And the value add of good risk management seems to be, it can be lost on the part of many organizations. But that's me in a nutshell. Very long-winded answer, how I got into risk, and happy to explore a few things.
That's fascinating. And I think just the way you talk about it, there's two things I love. One is that lovely piece where you're very honest about, well, then this happened and then that happened, because often we're encouraged to have this with hindsight story about how we knew that we were going to do this and then that. And so I love it when people just say, well, yeah, it was just a bit of luck and I knocked on a door here and then this happened and then that happened. And I think that's a lovely tale. But I'm struck that, you talk about risk and the importance within organizations. I mean, you've seen a whole range of different things. And as you say, there's the political risk piece captures, there's cultural elements to that. So if you are a multinational and you want to go and operate in a different jurisdiction, you've got to understand how that jurisdiction operates. And I'm struck by many global organizations trying to impose single standards for things. Particularly where you have a very strong home culture, and Japan, I think, is a great example of that. It doesn't necessarily roll out well. And so there's a real need to have that understanding. And I think that for me is a sort of fascinating piece, because clearly from a human risk perspective, that cultural difference is quite large. I mean, have you found as you've moved around the globe and looked at different massive differences in terms of risks and challenges?
I think, there are massive differences from a country to country perspective. There are massive differences in terms of how different organizations look at things. I've worked with Asian companies, I've worked with European companies, I've worked with American companies. But I was reading that book by Ray Dalio called Principles, not too long ago. And Ray Dalio has this thing about, it's another one of these. And after a while, in terms of seeing how companies get themselves into trouble and looking at different contexts, I remember doing a project on risk in Ecuador for an extractives energy company, and it looked very similar in terms of some of the causes. Now, it could be my own bias, but it seemed like, this is another one of these. This is another one of a company moving into a jurisdiction and taking at face value the laws of that jurisdiction and simply saying, okay, we've got a license now to operate in this part of Ecuador, and not taking into account the local dynamics. And particularly in a lot of developing economies, they're not homogenous. No country is homogenous, but the local political dynamics are just as, if not more important than the national dynamics. You can go into your national license to extract whatever it is, but if you don't understand the local dynamics, and that means the local communities, that means the NGOs, that means the indigenous groups, then you don't stand a chance. And not only that, but there are international dynamics with all of that. So if you are a major company and you don't understand that these local NGOs have ties with international NGOs, then you also are going to grossly underestimate the impacts that what you do may have in your home market. And that was a pattern that seemed to be repeating itself over loads of time. And you could talk about all of the cognitive biases out there. There's a bit of that concept of bike shedding. Do you want to explain that? So bike shedding is all about, we gravitate towards having debates about simple things. So it has to do with a story. I don't know if it's real or fictitious, of a nuclear power plant in a town, and you have lots of things to consider about health and safety and technical things and so on. But the debate becomes, what color is the bike shed in this nuclear power plant? And there's a lot of bike shedding that goes on in these organizations, in which, if you're an oil company, if you're a mining company, my experience has been they have all kinds of conversations about the oil price and oil price assumptions. They have all types of models and ways of doing that, all of the engineering risks and all of the technical risks. But the non-technical risks, those, in my experience, over doing a lot of this work, is the stuff that they didn't properly consider. And right about that time, as well, as when Taleb's book, The Black Swan, came out. And I got a bit frustrated with some of these clients of mine, because they kept calling to me these things that were happening, whether it was in the US, actually, where you started to see the same sorts of things, legal challenges and the like, as well as in emerging markets. And they would say, this is a black swan event. This is a black swan event. And I said, so I would use another acronym. So it's another BS acronym, because that is BS. But it wasn't the one that we're thinking about. It's blind spot. It's actually, you have a blind spot. There are people out there that know all about the local indigenous dynamics, and know all about the local community dynamics. They're anthropologists, they're sociologists, they're sustainable development people, there are environmental scientists, there are all types of people that you could ask. In fact, you do in terms of getting your licenses, but you don't ask those questions from a risk perspective. And it's a blind spot. It's not a black swan, it's a blind spot. And looking where you are unaccustomed to looking is the answer to having very good risk-based conversations about those types of endeavors. And I love doing that type of work. And I also find, and this goes to partially why I started the podcast I do, is that we do the same type of thing in our own lives. And it's very interesting to me how we do that and how to break that down.
And I think it's fascinating hearing you talk about that, because I'm sort of, the more I reflect on things that go wrong, inevitably someone somewhere could have told you that was going to happen. And most of the time you just choose not to listen to them because it doesn't occur to you. So either they're idiots who don't know anything, and I think particularly they're in organizations where we look in the 21st century, I think that graduates or people just leaving school, joining organizations, will have better oversight over 21st century risks in some cases than the CEO that's been there for 30 or 40 years. And you don't have to look too far around an understanding of social media. You're unlikely to be a social media expert if you're at the top of a big company because you've never really seen it. Whereas if you're a millennial or a Gen Z, you've grown up with this stuff. And I think if we look at things like climate risk and some of these technological and social trends, you're much better off tapping those, but nobody thinks to do that because, well, what do they know? They're just kids, and I am here and a senior person. And I think this idea that knowledge comes from expertise or tenure, I think is really dangerous. And I think it's very interesting when you talk in those terms that I think the risk management tools that we should be using now is we should be picking everybody's brains that we possibly can to get as much insight as we can, because in this fast changing world, things can blow up very, very quickly, literally and metaphorically. And I think the point you're making there around tapping people's expertise, particularly where it's not the obvious place to go, makes a heck of a lot of sense.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree with you more. And I've been that frustrated person who's sort of raising their hand in those meetings saying, watch out for this and watch out for that, but not being heard early on in my career. And I think it's fundamentally important that organizations really embrace the way in which millennials think about the world, and not only the way millennials think about the world, but there's one of my favorite books is a series of lectures by a master of Zen, and it's called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And there's a quote when he talked about experts, and you can see there's in the background there's a sword. I practice a martial art called Hapkido, and I'm learning the sword. So there's a Korean sword in the background. And one of the quotes in that book is that in the expert's mind, the possibilities are few, but in the beginner's mind, the possibilities are many. And I think that as organizations and people who are leaders in those organizations move up, and I see this in my own field of risk management, you really start to narrow the thinking becomes more and more narrow, and the jargon becomes thicker and heavier, and the barriers to entry as a result, the barriers of entry to those conversations become thicker.
That's kind of intentional, right?
It's kind of intentional.
I sometimes we build language as a means of, on the face of it, we need to have words for things. Mm-hmm. And what we do is we have technical terms for stuff. And this applies across disciplines. You can see it within the risk discipline as well. There's technical terms. And often the people can't actually explain the detailed technical term, but they use that piece. Yeah. And I've often thought that actually those terms are created as a means of conferring. I'm using technical language, therefore I know what I'm talking about. You are not using technical language and you don't understand the technical language. And that's how I kind of transmit my expertise. And I think this idea of complexity as a barrier to entry is I think there's something in our subliminal thing that says I'm going to create a sense of value in myself, and language is part of that.
Yeah, I agree, and we have this in the risk field where we use certain terms that really are jargon heavy. They're really kind of bullshit terms that exist, but they are barriers to having the type of, and particularly in risk, the types of conversations that we need to have are multidisciplinary. They should involve a lot of different perspectives. If we want to overcome cognitive biases, we need to bring in different ways of thinking. And you need to have people in the room that don't necessarily know what a risk frontier curve is, for example, that don't need to know, what the technical definition of risk appetite might be. But those inputs are incredibly valuable, particularly in the types of decision making that most organizations and most of us as individuals are making nowadays. They involve a variety of factors, and there are a number of dynamics, and just asking those simple questions of people outside of your kind of core skill set is incredibly powerful. I had my last podcast guest. His name is Frans Johansson. And I
love this one. I thought it's one of those ones I want to listen to again, because I just had to think really carefully about what you were saying, but it was really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, one of the stories that I loved from that conversation was this example he gave about a hospital in the UK trying to become more efficient, right? So they're trying to become more efficient at moving patients through the hospital. And what most organizations do is they'll say, okay, well, what do the other hospitals do, right? What is best practice? What do they do? And how can we copy that? And are we on the top quartile or the bottom quartile and all this stuff? And actually, that's the wrong way of looking at it. And what this hospital did is they looked at Formula One, right? Pit crews in Formula One have loads of experience in dealing with the same type of problem. And you can get much more insight from looking at a totally different field that has a similar type of problem that's solved in a certain way. And that's what they did. And that's what they used to innovate and, increase their, the ability to solve this problem of moving patients through the hospital more quickly.
But I mean, there's a prime example, right? That is counterintuitive and therefore to traditional logic, right? Why would I go and look at Formula One? What do they know about running hospitals? Mm-hmm. And the answer is probably on the face of it, nothing, because they're not running a medical operation. Mm-hmm. But actually, what do they know about making things quicker and building efficient processes where split-second timing is everything? A heck of a lot. Mm-hmm. And I agree. I think there's something interesting around grabbing from other disciplines that is underrated. And of course, if you're just copying from within your own sector, you might end up being best in class within that sector. But that's not necessarily optimal. Mm-hmm. And actually, I think sometimes you end up copying other people's crap ideas because there's this sort of presumption that they must know what they're doing, so I'm just going to copy them. And therein lies the path of kind of repetitive thing and making the same mistakes and I'm always struck by the kind of example of the iPhone, right? Well, let's create something that doesn't have a keyboard. Sounds really weird. We all get used to it now, but at the time that was kind of revolutionary because he went against the grain and picked something that wasn't copying what BlackBerry has done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where human risk comes into. Those are the seeds of human risk, is when you do that copying. Because I think you make a very profound point about copying the mistakes of others.
Yeah, and and I think particularly where you have a world of fast moving, changing things, and we're seeing sort of if you look at just what's in the news today, there's a heck of a lot of uncertainty and challenge and stuff that either we thought I'm struck by, for example, the fires in Australia. We kind of thought we had Mother Nature covered. And she's coming right back at us. And so and then you look at some of the virus stories and some of the political stories. There's a huge amount of things happening. And therefore, I think we need to be much more agile. And agility doesn't come from just copying the people in your own little sphere. That's fine if the world isn't constantly changing. And if the variables remain the same, then thinking about the processes in the same way makes sense. But the variables are shifting massively nowadays.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. We have to be being. I think there's a power nowadays in being a generalist, a very proficient generalist, and that this concept of skill stacking and as an individual is really powerful. You can add a lot of value as an individual, but if you can multiply that power in an organization, where you're drawing from different parts of different levels of expertise, then it makes a lot of sense. Conversely, I remember a recruiter that called me about 6 years ago when I was working at Accenture, and they wanted to recruit me for a company that was like an Accenture spinoff, like former partners of Accenture, but they very much modeled on the way Accenture was set up. And actually, I think Accenture is a fantastic organization, but and I'm not sure what the mandate that this particular gentleman had, but his question was, he wanted someone that had a bunch of boxes that I ticked, right? So, 7 to 10 years of experience at the time. He wanted a certain level of education, and they're only hiring people like this. And I do not want to work for a bunch of clones, right? This is ridiculous. And so, I thanked him and ended the phone call. But that thinking, it bothers me a lot. It's very, very pervasive, and it gets people and organizations into a lot of trouble.
But it's just obviously perverse, right? Because if I have a table full of people that are clones of me, we're going to have ideas that one person on their own could generate, right? And you saw that, and financial services being the prime example. Take a look at the boardrooms round about the crisis in financial services, and there were people, slightly older versions of people that looked like me, thinking in those terms. And you start to introduce diversity, and hey, guess what? There's different ways of it, and whether that's male-female diversity or other forms of diversity. And I think particularly cognitive diversity is interesting, because I see lots of examples of kind of people trying to create a Benetton ad in terms of their boardroom shop, right? So we'll make sure we've covered all the bases up there. But actually, if you don't build an environment where those people are free to speak, and you don't give them the opportunity to speak because your structures, and I'm on a real mission at the moment around meeting structures, because I think meetings are set up as a really bad way of encouraging debate and discussion, because we start off with, first thing we do is we review the minutes of the previous meeting. Well, what does that do? Well, the answer is subconsciously, it reminds you of the last time you got together in the room. So you frame the discussion as Groundhog Day, repeat performance of last time round. And then we look at the whole structure. And I think there's something really, really fascinating around it. And everybody at the moment is jumping on the diversity bandwagon. And of course, that's critically important. You've got to get them in the room in the first place. But if you don't allow people the freedom to speak and the opportunity to bring their own thoughts, then you don't have the inclusion piece. And there's no point in having visual diversity if you haven't got the inclusion bit that goes with it.
Yeah, love that. Cognitive diversity. We need to latch onto that. Very, very good point. All these, these boards in every country, it's basically the same cabal of people that sit on the boards of the largest companies in those countries. They just do a round robin, and it's incestuous.
I'll sit on your board if you sit on mine type of arrangement.
Yeah. Right. And, unfortunately, Davos reflects that as well, the composition of people that go to Davos.
I was fascinating, watching that. And you're right, it's the same old characters, the same old faces. And you kind of watch it particularly on the 24-hour news channels. You sort of see these people appearing, and it just looks like a certain subset of people is running the world. And it's no surprise that we have plenty of global challenges when we're not letting in those intelligent ways of thinking. So it's back to your hospital example, right? It's literally, we're consulting amongst ourselves to protect a way of thinking that has got us to where we've got to. I was struck by your comments around the importance of risk. And I think this plays into this theme a little bit, because if I look at it, many industries, risk is kind of a necessary evil, right? So we're required to have a risk. So particularly in a regulated, who's managing your role? Well, we better have a chief risk officer with some risk people. And it sort of often sits at the box ticking end of the spectrum. So we better have a risk report that reports on the risks, and we better have risk committees that discuss the risks, and we better have a framework to manage those risks. And I think it's very interesting when you look at the sort of the comfort people take from that. And they go, well, we have some risk people that look at this stuff. But actually, the fundamentals of business, as you were describing, involve taking risk, right? You don't make money if you don't take any risk. Therefore, it shouldn't be this kind of sit alongside function of the process in the same way that you have, I don't know, you maybe have a print room, right? The print stuff. So we'll have a risk function. It needs to be embedded in the heart of the organization. And I think it's really interesting as you're exploring your journey. I think we're starting to see that integration of risk and a risk mindset across the organization in a way that I think historically we haven't.
I hope so. I hope so, Christian. I maybe don't share your level of enthusiasm, but I think in the financial services world, yes. I think outside of the financial services world, it's still taking some time, and I think sometimes the intelligentsia around risk can be a detriment to that. So we love to create cottage industries. We love to, there's a phenomenon in which you can, it's the same with take an organization that has a sort of a mission and, a philanthropic mission. And let's say they resolve that. I think there's a phenomenon that, the organization wants to stay alive. So they'll find, another cause or another
right.
thing to remedy. And I think we've, in the risk business, have created all kinds of bullshit that keeps us busy and keeps us talking about this stuff. And we have to be on guard for that. And we have to fight against it. And we need risk professionals that are trying to, in some ways, do themselves out of a job, or do themselves out of that job of being that sort of risk committee that sits outside of the organization, and be the types of people that take, that have a skin in the game and sit alongside other members of the C-suite and decision makers, and are invested in making the decision in the right way and making a quality decision, and get really embedded into the content of what the business is talking about. So I think we're getting there in some respects, but maybe I need to take a step back a little bit and see how it's working. But I think there are a number of challenges that are still out there.
But I think there's a really interesting articulation there, right? Which is in essence, if I kind of take what you said to the logical extremity, you'd be saying to yourself, okay, if we can get risk management and understanding of risk and people thinking about risk in the right way, you wouldn't need a risk function, right? Logically, because it's embedded in the organization. And so you wouldn't be artificially imposing this thing into the structures, because everybody would kind of think in those terms. And maybe you'd need, and I'm always struck by the model of a court jester, right? So if you go way back when, the kings and queens had this court jester, and it was the only person that was allowed to take the piss out of the monarch. And it was a risk management tool. And I'm reading a little bit around this stuff at the moment. And it was a way of, somebody had to call them out. You couldn't have somebody doing it in an insubordinate way. So a junior person, is never going to be able to make that challenge. So how do they do that? Well, they use comedy as a construct, and they can, and clearly there are limits to what they're allowed to say. But I think there's something really interesting there that says, those senior people need to be called out. So we've built this construct and they wear stupid clothes, and everybody knows that they're the only ones allowed to do it. And they can call the monarch out. And I think that was a really interesting form of risk management that sort of we would possibly do well to readapt nowadays, because we are, as you say, there's a lot of formulaic bullshit where, I have a big fat risk report and I have a radar and I use lots of clever things and actually that doesn't help you manage the day-to-day risk, because actually one of the biggest risks, and speaking my own book here, is human decision making and people doing crazy stuff and no one calling them out on it. And we've seen it so often. I mean, WeWork, great example, sort of slightly narcissistic CEO who goes off and does crazy forays. Why was this not being called? And I'd make the same argument with Facebook. I don't think anyone's challenging him around some of the issues. And particularly where some of these companies have huge amounts of power, and the people sitting in those senior positions don't necessarily have the experience to be able to handle all the risks that are there. They need to be called out. So I'm kind of pushing my jester model as a 21st century thing.
I like it. I have. There's a shift that a number of people in the risk industry need to make if they are going to transition into being court jesters, and maybe that starts with not taking themselves as seriously as some do. But I like it. I really like it.
And look, I absolutely want to spend some time on the podcast, which is one of those things. As I sort of suddenly thought, hey, podcast could be an interesting place to learn new things. When I was in my previous kind of risk and compliance roles, and I kind of just typed in the word risk into, I think, iTunes, and I thought maybe someone's done something. And of course, you get all the professional courses and the dull stuff, right? Yep. And then I came across your podcast called The All Thing, and I was like, this is cool. I really like the sound of this. And having listened to a number of your episodes, I won't say I've listened to all of them, but I'm working my way through them. it's just this wonderful endeavor where you invite people, and I think you yourself, it's like your way of talking to really interesting people around risk. And then you beautifully frame it as life is risk, which I think is a really nice kind of articulation. I mean, how did you come up with the idea?
Well, I'm a fan of the medium, first of all. When I got into podcasts seriously when I started to train for marathons, because you'd go on these long runs and music was something like after an hour of listening to music, it would just get a little bit boring. So I started to plug into lots of podcasts. And so I listened to lots of them. And what struck me about the medium was that you can go long form. You don't have to have, a set, it doesn't have to be an hour. It doesn't have to be 30 minutes. There are no sound bites. And the ones that I really loved are the long form conversations, the Joe Rogan Experience, Mark Manson, who interviews celebrities. And I thought, wow, we've kind of lost the art of conversation. And I thought maybe I know some interesting people. Maybe I could do this. So I did it as a bit of an experiment. I did it so first of all, it was for an audience of one, which is me when I started. And I thought, what a great excuse to just be able to, say, talk to somebody. Like I had Alex Hutchinson, whose book I read about endurance sport. And I loved his book. And then I sent him an email. Would you like to talk to me for an hour about your book? And he said, yes. But how else could you do that? Right. So
I hadn't really thought of that. Because if you just phone someone up and say, can I have an hour's phone conversation or meeting with you? They would look at you like you were some kind of weirdo. Whereas in the podcast construct, that's very smart. I like that.
So partially that's how I kind of started by I just want to have conversations with interesting people. And the other aspect is that as I was working in my professional world, I sort of came to the realization that I'm part of me in my professional life. What we're trying to do is we're trying to either eliminate risk, or we think about risk in a very negative way, both professionally, but also in life in general. A lot of the advertising that targets us is about being comfortable. It's about avoiding risk. And every time I did anything interesting and fulfilling in life, it's when I actually took a risk, right? And every time I was unhappy in a job or in my life, it's when I became overly anxious about stuff, about worries. And I thought, well, let's try and turn that on its head. And I thought, well, who else thinks like this? And so I started to turn to adventurers and athletes and entrepreneurs and people that have a totally different way of looking at uncertainty and risk than the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis, than the advertising that we tend to get in mainstream media. And that's kind of the ethos that I started the podcast around. And it just, it's basically gone from there.
And I love that articulation around the way risk is sold to us. So we have insurance to deal when nasty things happen to us, you're covered. Mm-hmm. And we're kind of scared into this thing. And as you were talking, I was thinking, well, why is that? Well, I think the answer is we come onto the planet, and providing we have a sort of stable childhood, generally speaking, we're looked after, and security and safety and all those things become critical. And then as we become adults, we kind of want to organize the world in a manner where we know what's going on, where we feel comfortable, and we know that nothing bad is going to happen to us because it's all safe and repeated. And of course, the world isn't like that. And I think it's really interesting, even if you look at things like traditional careers where job security, and my parents who do listen to this podcast, so I'll be careful what I say, but they so every time I've changed jobs, there's always been this, you're leaving that company to go somewhere else. And then it repeats itself. And I find it really funny because it's kind of like, the company that I'm now proposing to leave is the one you were scared about me joining ages ago.
Yeah.
And so, but I think the concept of career, job security is going for all sorts of dynamics and reasons. And I think we crave this stability and security. But you're right. Amazing things happen when you step outside that. I mean, terrible things happen as well. Let's be clear. It's not all kind of upside. But I love that idea that we're risk is pushed down the channels. And it isn't just professionals talking about it. It's the way stuff is marketed to us as a negative.
That's right. And I think, we all need a level of security and comfort. And for the most part in the Western world, we have that. If worse comes to worse, we'll survive, right? We don't, we're talking to each other here in the UK, in spite of Brexit and everything else. We're not going to be hungry. We're not going to go hungry. And so, I do appreciate that there are people that don't have that, but for the vast majority of people listening to this, we have some basic levels of security, and we could be taking more risk as individuals and as organizations, but I'm talking more about as individuals. And is that sort of cliche that, growth happens when you're outside your comfort zone? But I do believe that. I think that that's true.
Hi, it's Christian again. And that concludes part 1 of my conversation with Ben Cattaneo. My thanks to Ben for appearing on the podcast and to you for listening. You can find the details of the books and other things that Ben referenced in the show notes. There is also a link to the All Things Risk podcast that clearly comes highly recommended. You'll find that wherever you get your quality audio content or via the links in the show notes. Stay tuned for part 2 of my conversation with Ben, coming very soon wherever you found this.